Good morning, class. My name is Trey Hillier.
I'm Valerie Russell, and today we're going to be talking about are genetically modified foods safe for human consumption.
So I'm sure everyone here has heard about GMOs before, but I'd like to ask everyone here, how many of you have heard that they cause health effects on humans? Alright.
So we're just going to talk a little bit about what a genetically modified food is. It is a food in which the DNA structure is altered in a way that would not occur naturally. According to Chelsea Powell at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, the plants are modified to create a more beneficial offspring. The modified offspring is going to allow for the structure of the seed to be stronger. Having a more sound structure is going to allow for it to be more resistant to diseases and herbicides, which is ultimately going to make them safer to consume.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about when the first GMO was introduced. According to Chassis, the first successful GMO was created in 1988. This was a soybean created to be resistant to the herbicide glyphosate. So this allowed farmers to apply this herbicide to their fields without actually killing the soybeans. This also results in better growth due to the soybeans not having to compete with weeds for nutrients in the soil.
Genetically modified foods do not occur naturally, so it's important to understand how they are made before we consume them. According to Chelsea Powell at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, scientists have a hypothesis before choosing the trait to modify. Once the trait is chosen, the appropriate environment will be identified and later the plants will be screened. The next step is to isolate the genetic trait, and this is done by analyzing the genomes. After the trait has been isolated, it is going to be inserted into the genome. This is done by cutting and pasting the genetic trait into a plasmid using enzymes. The seeds are difficult to alter due to their rigid structure, and this is going to lead to the development of gene guns. These guns shoot metal particles coated with DNA into plant tissue. According to Zizai Lim at the Genetic Literacy Project, once the seed has been modified, it's going to undergo a process called transcription. This is going to allow for the DNA to become mRNA. The next process is translation, and this is going to allow for the mRNA to become protein. This is going to allow, the protein is what's going to be seen in the genetically modified food. And this image on the next slide shows what I was talking about with how it's inserted into the genetic trait and then it's eventually grown where the trait is going to be seen.
Alright, so now I'm going to talk about some of the pros GMOs have. The first topic is human health. According to Norris, all accusations that GMOs cause health conditions have been tested. So there's a few of his tests I'd like to describe to you guys. The first one contains two groups of rats. One was fed GMO containing potato and the other was fed non-GMO containing potato. The test involved feeding these rats throughout their whole life, and once they passed away, there was an autopsy done to see if there's any type of toxicity or organ defects within the rats. Norris found that there was no difference between the rats and no toxicity or defects. The second experiment contains four groups of rats. The first being a GMO-fed group that's tomato, the second GMO sweet pepper, and then two groups that were non-GMO tomato and sweet pepper. This is pretty much the same procedure. They fed this rats throughout their whole life, and once that was done, they did an autopsy to see what happened. But only this time, they fed them 7,000 times the daily value of this GMO. After they passed and the autopsy was done, they found that there was no toxicity or no organ defects found, and there was no difference between the two groups. The final experiment he conducted was to answer questions that maybe the defects can only be seen in the following generations. So he fed two groups of rats, one a GMO, one non-GMO, and followed it through 3 generations, each time observing litter size and developmental aspects. And after the 3 generations, he found that there was no difference between litter size or developmental defects within the groups. And lastly, I'd like to state that the DNA inserted into GMOs is no different than the 0.1 to 1 grams of DNA consumed each day in a diet, which the FDA considers safe. This can answer for the assumption that the gene inserted into DNA sequence of GMOs is more likely to come out of sequence and possibly cause mutations within the consumer. Next, I'd like to talk about the environment. According to Penn State Ag Science magazine, some GMO crops are resistant to herbicides and insects. This would allow more crops to be harvested in comparison to organic crops because they won't have to compete with weeds or they won't be destroyed by insects. The Penn State Ag Science magazine also states that with proper application of herbicides, you can reduce runoff and cross-contamination. I'd also like to state that some insecticides are incorporated into the crops, so you won't have to even apply a topical insecticide. So there won't be runoff there at all. Next, population growth. According to Penn State Ag Science magazine, by 2050, the population is projected to be near 10 billion. They state that farmers need to produce 70% more food in order to accommodate the growth. And without GMOs, organic crops simply won't be able to compete with that and grow enough food. Lastly, I'd like to talk about malnourished populations. So some GMOs are able to add nutrients that can accommodate for deficiencies, specifically in low-income populations. Dawn University, a specific GMO called golden rice, which contains a beta-carotene to address vitamin A deficiencies. Growing these GMOs can also boost local economies because the farmers will be growing and selling these crops right within their community. And by doing this, these GMOs can also help reduce child mortality rates because you'll be increasing the nutrition within the kids, so they'll have the nutrition they need. And here's the illustration I have to kind of explain how golden rice is created. So the gene that is taken from daffodils is the one that gives them the beta-carotene to produce the vitamin A deficiency. This gene is inserted into the DNA sequence, which is then added to a petri dish with the rice embryo so that it can contaminate it with that gene, and then it's incorporated into local rice strands so that it can adapt and grow well in that local environment.
So there are several cons that are really important to discuss for genetically modified foods. And the first is to look at their impact on the risk for the environment. Genetically modified crops don't use pesticides, but that doesn't mean they aren't toxic to the environment. According to Emily Glass at One Green Planet, if an insect were to land on a genetically modified food and eat part of it, it could have several effects on the animal. No matter what animal unknowingly feeds off the GMO, we cannot afford to lose them since every organism is vital in the food chain. And the toxicity of genetically modified food can be dangerous to those that are already on the endangered species list. Due to genetically modified foods being a newer product, the long-term effects are unknown. When pesticides are used on crops, pests eventually adapt. It is currently unknown for how the pests are going to adapt and what the effect is going to be. Genetically modified foods put the diversity of plants at risk. According to Emily Glass at One Green Planet, the use of the modified seed is taking over what the organic seed once did. They produce less of the pollen that is needed. Toxins are produced as a result of genetically modified foods and as a byproduct kill the bacteria in the soil. These bacteria are vital for healthy plants to grow without fertilizers. Without the removal of toxins from bacteria, the residues are left in the soil for genetically modified crops. As a result, the soil becomes dry and doesn't have proper nutrients. The irrigation used in the growing process is going to allow for problems to occur in the soil and also in the air. And this causes many organisms to be exposed to the toxins. In the bigger picture, the DNA from genetically modified foods may end up not in the intended place, such as the soil, compost, and animal feed. Since more organisms are exposed to the toxins in the environment, they become part of the larger problem. The effects of the agricultural risks are often not seen to the naked eye, but are still very relevant. The next con is labeling, which is a very large problem. According to Graham Weiss at the New Republic, companies administering both genetically modified food and organic food had to create separate production lines starting from the fields leading to the factories and eventually even to the grocery stores. This process would require new bins for transporting, new trucks for physically moving the products, and even new cleaning supplies to make sure the shelves are ready for the product. Also, thousands of new workers would have to be hired into the force of harvesting, evaluating, and cleaning the product, which is a pro in the job economy, but in the long term for the company can cost them a lot of money. According to Andrew Amlick at The Modern Farmer, in 2016, a federal law was passed that required producers to identify genetically modified foods. They can choose to identify the food by a symbol or a QR code or having a phone number on their product, and this would allow for the individual to get more information. Unfortunately for the poor and the elderly, they don't have as easy access to technology, which is going to limit those who are educated about what they're eating. Since the law is fairly new, there is still some uncertainty about what is required to be labeled. Genetically modified crops such as corn and soy will be required to be labeled, and common processed food like corn syrup and soybean oil will not have to be labeled. Animal byproducts like milk, butter, and meat will not have to be labeled if they were fed genetically modified food. Producers who are certified organic will be able to label their food as non-GMO under the new law. And this is an image that shows an example of what a label might be. So this one has a website on it, which would be, for those who have access to technology, can go and look up information if they choose. It's also really small on the label, so it's really important to just note that it's not very easily to see. The last con is human reaction. Ever since people have discovered that some of the food they eat have been modified by scientists, there have been questions on the effect they have on their health. In fact, most people do not even know what a GMO is, but they think they are harmful to their environment. GMOs are looked upon so negatively that in 2013, organic or non-GMO products increased their sales by 80%. Increase in these products not containing any GMOs has increased so much that farmers and big brands have started to adapt their product to what the consumers want, making them organic or non-GMO. Most anti-GMO supporters argue that GMOs cannot be considered safe without rigorous scientific testing. According to Environmental Science Europe, a lot of anti-GMO groups try to expose experiments to support their belief of GMOs being harmful. Another concern about GMOs is if they have any offspring, if they have an effect on offspring. Some people argue that GMOs have a long-term health effect and may toxify reproductive organs, causing the effects to not only be seen in this generation but following generations. Understandably, people just do not want to think the risk of having a child with birth defects is worth consuming the product. Since the risk can be avoided by simply buying organic products, which are more popular now than ever, to completely eliminate the chance of having a child with defects or not being to have children at all. People just do not want to risk the possibility of damaging their lives or their future families' lives.
So, in conclusion, after doing all this research and comparing and contrasting positives and negatives, we believe that GMOs are not harmful to humans. So we'd like to leave you with a few questions. The first, are the scientific tests done to prove GMOs are not harmful enough to persuade the population? And secondly, is having enough food for the world more important than the potential risks that GMOs come with?